I'm going to keep gathering all the receipts. He is such a liar.
He thought he had built an empire no one could touch. 14 years of marriage, a Georgian estate on 16 acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, 3 children with names old enough to carry weight in rooms where weight mattered, a seat on the board of Hargrove Capital, a private equity firm that his grandfather had started with a handshake and a promise in 1951. Marcus Hargrove III was not just a wealthy man. He was a monument, a category, the kind of man who didn't worry about consequences because consequences, in his experience, had always belonged to other people. His wife, Cecelia Hargrove, born Cecelia Ann Whitmore, was the woman who stood beside that monument and made it look beautiful. She chaired the Greenwich Children's Foundation. She organized the Winter Gala every December. She raised their 3 children, attended every school play, every lacrosse match, every piano recital, while Marcus flew between New York and London and Tokyo, managing money that most people would never see in 3 lifetimes. She was, by every visible measure, the perfect Hargrove wife, and that was the most dangerous thing about her. Because while Marcus Hargrove III was sleeping in a penthouse suite at Claridge's in London with a 31-year-old named Simone Arsenault, Cecelia was sitting at the antique writing desk in her study, surrounded by 14 months of receipts, bank statements, hotel folios, flight logs, and private investigator reports, building a case so airtight that when she finally moved, it would not look like a divorce. It would look like a demolition, carried out with the quiet precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. This is the story of what happens when you underestimate the woman you married. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what Cecelia destroyed, you first have to understand what she built. Marcus Hargrove and Cecelia Whitmore had met at a charity polo match in the Hamptons in the summer of 2008. She was 26, a Yale-educated art historian working as a curatorial assistant at Sotheby's. He was 31, already managing $100 million in assets for Hargrove Capital, and already wearing the particular brand of confidence that comes from being told your whole life that you are exceptional. He had seen her standing near the paddock fence, holding a glass of Sauvignon Blanc, looking at the horses with the kind of focused attention most people reserved for things they genuinely loved. He walked over and told her she was the most composed woman he had ever seen at an event like this. She looked at him and said, calmly, that composure was simply what happened when you refuse to be impressed by things designed to impress you. He fell in love with her in that moment, or what he understood love to be, which was the feeling of encountering something he had not yet figured out how to own. They were married 18 months later in a ceremony at the Whitmore family estate in Newport, Rhode Island. 400 guests, gardenias flown in from Italy, a string quartet that had once played for European royalty. It was the kind of wedding that appeared in Town and Country magazine. Cecelia wore an ivory Vera Wang gown with a 12-foot train and looked, according to the caption, like a woman stepping into her natural inheritance. What the caption did not say, because captions never say these things, was that Cecelia had already begun to understand something about Marcus on the morning of that wedding. She had overheard him on the phone in his dressing room, laughing too easily with a woman whose voice she did not recognize, saying things that were not quite appropriate for a man getting married in 4 hours. She had stood in the hallway, her veil in her hand, and she had made a decision. She decided to marry him anyway, because she was 27 years old, and she believed in the possibility of people becoming better versions of themselves. She decided to love him into the man she believed he was capable of being. It was the most expensive decision she ever made, and 14 years later, sitting at her antique writing desk in the study of a house that she had designed and decorated and made into a home, she was finally collecting on the debt. It was a Tuesday in October, nearly 14 months before the story ended. Marcus had left for London that morning on the Hargrove Capital private jet, which was technically owned by the firm, but which Marcus treated as a personal vehicle, the way some men treat a pickup truck. He had kissed Cecelia on the cheek at 6 in the morning, told her the trip would be 5 days, and walked out the front door pulling a carry-on that was far too light for a man attending 4 days of high-stakes investor meetings. Cecelia noticed. She noticed because she had been noticing things for a long time. The light carry-on, the new cologne, the way he had started working out again after years of not caring, the way he smiled at his phone when he thought she was looking at the children. She noticed all of it, but noticing was not the same as knowing, and she needed to know. That night, after the children were in bed, Cecelia went into Marcus's home office to find the charger for her iPad, which he frequently borrowed, and returned to the wrong room. His desk was tidy, the way it always was, everything in its appointed place. His personal laptop was closed but not shut down. The screen was dark, but the indicator light was still a soft, pulsing blue. She had never touched his laptop. In 14 years of marriage, she had never once sat down at that desk and opened a file that was not her own. That boundary had been a point of pride for her. Trust, she had always believed, was something you demonstrated through action. She sat down. She opened the laptop. She told herself later that she only meant to find the charger cable, which was visible behind the laptop stand. But her hand moved to the trackpad before she could stop it. The screen woke up. It did not ask for a password. Marcus had recently changed his settings, disabling the sleep password for convenience. Convenience had always been his greatest weakness. The browser was open. The last tab was an email account. Not his work account, not his personal Gmail, but a third account she had never seen, registered under the name M. Grant. The inbox was full. She scrolled. She read. By the time she reached the emails from 14 months ago, which were the oldest ones before the thread began, she understood the entire shape of what had been happening. Simone Arsenault, a French-American architect based in London, 31 years old, who had met Marcus at a conference 18 months earlier and had been in a relationship with him, a full, functioning, emotionally intimate relationship, for the entirety of that time. There were hotel confirmations. There were weekend plans. There were messages of a tenderness that Marcus had not shown Cecelia in years, and there was, in a message from just 3 days ago, a sentence that Cecelia read 4 times before she allowed herself to feel it. It said, "I know you can't leave her yet, but I want you to know that I've stopped thinking of myself as the other woman. I've started thinking of myself as the real one." Cecelia sat at that desk for 45 minutes. The house was completely silent around her. She could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, slow and deliberate, the way you breathe when you are deciding something enormous. She did not cry. She would cry later, alone in the bathroom with the shower running, 3 nights in a row, in the particular way of women who have learned not to be witnessed in their worst moments. But at that desk, she did not cry. She opened her phone and took photographs of every email she could find. Then she closed the laptop, replaced it exactly where it had been, found her charger cable, and went upstairs to bed. In the morning, she called her college roommate, Diana Ashworth, who had been a family law attorney in New York for 16 years. She did not call from her personal phone. She walked to the CVS on the Post Road and bought a prepaid phone with cash. Then she sat in her car in the CVS parking lot and made the call. Diana answered on the second ring. Cecelia said 4 words. "I need your help." Diana said, "I know. I've been waiting for this call." And just like that, the clock started. What Cecelia did over the next 14 months was not impulsive. It was not emotional. It was architectural. She built her case the way she had once built the wing of a museum collection, piece by piece, with absolute attention to provenance, to context, to the weight and meaning of each individual item. The first thing she did was open her own accounts, not joint accounts, separate accounts at a separate bank, in a separate state, funded by wire transfers so small and so infrequent that they did not register against the household's financial radar. She had always managed the household finances. Marcus had given her that responsibility years ago because numbers bored him, which was a remarkable thing to say about a man who managed billions of other people's money. What it meant in practice was that Cecelia had a precise and comprehensive understanding of every financial current flowing through their life together. She knew the accounts. She knew the assets. She knew the trusts. She knew the tax structures. She knew, specifically, that Marcus had been routing a significant portion of his personal management fees through a shell company registered in Delaware called MG Advisory Group, and that the MG in MG Advisory Group did not stand for Marcus Hargrove. It stood for M. Grant, his alias, his mistress's surname. He had named a company after his cover identity. The arrogance of that almost made her laugh. She brought this information to Diana, who brought in a forensic accountant named Patricia Osei, a quiet, meticulous woman who wore small gold earrings and spoke in the even tone of someone who had seen every variety of financial deception and was surprised by none of it. Patricia spent 6 weeks combing through everything Cecelia provided and came back with a report that was 43 pages long. The summary was simple. Marcus had been systematically siphoning marital assets through MG Advisory Group for at least 3 years, directing those funds toward expenses that included, but were not limited to, a furnished apartment in Knightsbridge, a leased Jaguar in Simone's name, 2 international vacations per year, and a jewelry budget that Patricia estimated at roughly $400,000 over the 3-year period. None of this had been disclosed on the couple's joint tax returns. None of it had been discussed with Cecelia. All of it was marital money, and all of it was now documented. Cecelia read the report at her kitchen table while her children were at school. When she finished, she closed the folder and sat for a long moment looking at the garden through the kitchen window. The roses she had planted in the spring of their first year in the house were still blooming, red and determined against the October cold. Then she opened the folder again and wrote 3 words at the top of the page in her careful handwriting. Not yet. Not yet. Because Cecelia was not ready to move. She needed one more thing. She needed to know how deep Marcus's loyalty to Simone actually ran. And she needed to know because what she was planning required her to understand whether he would fight for the relationship or abandon it the moment it became inconvenient. So she waited. She watched. She had hired a private investigator named Frank Delano, a former state police detective who wore the same tan jacket every time they met and who delivered information with the emotional affect of a man reading a weather report. Frank gave her photographs, flight manifests, hotel records, restaurant receipts. In 14 months, Marcus had taken Simone to Paris, to the Maldives, to a private villa in Tuscany that he had rented under the MG Advisory Group account, and to a New Year's Eve party in Edinburgh where he had introduced her, according to a guest interviewed by Frank, as his partner. His partner, not his colleague, not his friend, his partner. Cecelia had that interview transcript laminated. She kept it in the folder with the word, "Not yet," written on it. And then,
While Cecelia
on a
was
Monday
building her
morning in the first
architecture,
week of December,
Marcus was living
she
in a
wrote
world
a new
where
word
consequences
beneath it,
had not yet
"Now."
arrived.
This is the nature of men like Marcus Hargrove III. They move through life in a permanent present tense, sealed off from the future by their own certainty that the future will arrange itself around their preferences. He had convinced himself, in the specific way that people who are doing wrong convince themselves that he was not a bad man. He loved his children. He was proud of them, with the particular pride of a man who considered his children a reflection of his own quality. He was generous with Cecelia in material ways. The house, the cars, the household account that she could access without question. He told himself that the arrangement with Simone was not a betrayal but a necessity, the inevitable consequence of being a man of his intensity, married to a woman whose emotional temperature ran cool. He told himself that Cecelia was fine, that she was content, that she would not want to know. He had been telling himself this for 18 months, and it had worked so seamlessly that he had stopped thinking of it as a lie and had started thinking of it as the truth. In London, in the suite at Claridge's where the sheets were changed daily and the room service arrived on silver trays, Marcus was, for the first time in years, something approaching happy. Simone was brilliant and demanding, and she challenged him in ways that Cecelia, absorbed in the children and the charity work and the social calendar, had stopped doing. He understood somewhere below the level of conscious thought that what he was chasing in Simone was a version of himself that he preferred, a Marcus who was not yet an institution, who was still capable of surprise. He did not understand, because self-knowledge was not his gift, that Simone was simply reflecting back to him the version of himself he wanted to see. That is the function of a mistress in a story like this. Not love. A mirror, angled just right. He called Cecelia every evening at 7, London time. He asked about the children by name, in order, which had always been his way of demonstrating engagement. He said he missed her cooking, which was something she had hired a private chef to do 2 years ago. He said the meetings were going well and that he expected to be home by Friday. She said that was wonderful. She said the children sent their love. She asked if he was eating properly. He said yes. She said good. And then they said goodbye in the pleasant, frictionless way of two people performing a marriage for each other's benefit, neither of them quite believing the performance, one of them actively dismantling it. He had no idea. That was the thing that would haunt him later, in the particular way that humiliation haunts people who have always thought of themselves as perceptive. He had no idea. He had looked at his wife every day for 14 years, and he had seen a beautiful, capable, well-managed woman, and he had failed entirely to see the mind behind it. He had mistaken her composure for contentment. He had mistaken her silence for acceptance. He had made the oldest mistake in the history of arrogant men. He had confused his wife's grace with her limitation. Diana filed the divorce petition on a Wednesday morning, the second week of December. She filed it in Greenwich Superior Court, which was the correct jurisdiction, and she filed it under seal, which was possible given the financial complexity of the case. This meant that for 72 hours, Marcus Hargrove would have no idea that the petition existed. Cecelia had planned those 72 hours with the same attention she gave to her gala seating charts. On Wednesday afternoon, she met with the board of directors of the Greenwich Children's Foundation in her capacity as chair. She presented the annual report, discussed the spring fundraiser, and then mentioned, calmly, that she would be stepping back from the chairmanship in the new year for personal reasons. The foundation's executive director, a woman named Margaret Cho who had known Cecelia for 11 years, said she was sorry to hear it and asked if everything was all right. Cecelia said everything was fine, just a matter of priorities shifting. Margaret nodded. She did not look convinced, but she did not press. That was the social code of Greenwich, Connecticut. You did not press. On Thursday morning, Cecelia drove the children to school herself, which she did not always do. She walked each of them to their classroom. She held their faces in her hands, for a moment longer than usual. She told them she loved them in the specific language she had developed for each one. Because each of her children was distinct, and she had always believed that love, spoken in a generic voice, lands like a generic thing. Then she drove home, made herself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself exactly 20 minutes to feel the full weight of what she was ending. She thought about the polo match in the Hamptons. She thought about the wedding in Newport. She thought about the way Marcus had held their oldest daughter on the night she was born, standing in the hospital room with this enormous, uncertain tenderness on his face, looking like a man who had just been handed something he understood he was not yet worthy of. She thought about all the moments when the marriage had been real, or real enough, and then she put those moments in a room in her mind and closed the door, because the woman who needed to walk through the next few weeks could not afford to keep that door open. On Thursday afternoon, Patricia Osei submitted the forensic accounting report to the IRS as part of a formal disclosure package regarding MG Advisory Group's unreported income. Patricia had prepared this filing with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. It was clean, it was comprehensive, it was the kind of filing that lands on an agent's desk and immediately goes to the top of the stack. On Friday morning, Marcus flew home from London on the Hargrove Capital jet, landing at Westchester County Airport at 10:15 in the morning. His driver met him at the tarmac. He was in a good mood. He had closed a significant deal in London. He had spent the last 2 nights with Simone in the Claridge's suite, and he was looking forward to the weekend with a clear conscience, which was not actually a clear conscience, but had so successfully disguised itself as one that the distinction had ceased to matter to him. He texted Cecelia from the car. "On my way home. Can't wait to see you and the kids," she replied immediately. "Drive safe. We'll be here." And then, after a short pause, she sent a second message. "Actually, the children are at Mom's for the weekend. It's just us." He smiled at that. He walked in through the front door of the Georgian estate at 11:45 in the morning. The house smelled of fresh flowers, which Cecelia arranged every week, and of something warm from the kitchen. He set his bag down in the foyer. He called her name. She answered from the study. He walked down the hallway and pushed open the study door. Cecelia was sitting at the antique writing desk. She was dressed simply, in dark trousers and a cream blouse, her dark hair pulled back. She looked calm and composed, as she always did, and for 1/2 second, Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of coming home to a woman who made everything look effortless. Then he noticed the desk. It was covered in organized stacks of paper, each stack held with a binder clip, each binder clip labeled with a piece of white tape. He saw the words, MG Advisory Group, on one label. He saw the words, Hotel Folios, on another. He saw the words, Simone A, on a third, and the satisfaction curdled into something cold and shapeless in his chest. Cecelia looked up at him. She was not angry. She was not crying. She looked, if anything, like a woman who has been waiting a long time for an appointment that has finally arrived. "Hello, Marcus," she said. "Sit down. We have a few things to discuss." He did not sit down immediately. He stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched like taffy, and his mind moved fast through its options, the way the mind of a man like Marcus always moved, cataloging, calculating, looking for the angle. He thought about denial. He thought about the staged confusion of a man encountering an accusation so wild it could not possibly be true. He thought about the controlled concession, the careful admission of a small truth designed to stop the inquiry before it reached the larger ones. He had used all of these in boardrooms. He understood leverage. He understood that the person who speaks first in a negotiation is usually the person who loses it. So he stayed quiet, and he looked at the desk, and he tried to determine from the visible documents how much she actually knew. He understood from Simone's name on the label that she knew about the affair. He understood from MG Advisory Group that she had found the shell company. The hotel folios troubled him. He sat down in the leather chair across the desk, which was his usual chair, the one he sat in when he worked from home, and the irony of now sitting in it, as though before a judge, was not lost on him, though he would not have used the word judge. He was still thinking of this as a conversation he could manage. "Marcus," Cecelia said, "I am going to speak for a while. I would like you to listen completely before you say anything." He nodded. She opened a folder. She spoke for 22 minutes. She covered the email account she had found in October of the previous year. She covered the 14 months of investigation. She covered the MG Advisory Group findings, citing specific dollar amounts, specific dates, specific transactions. She covered the hotel records, the apartment in Knightsbridge, the villa in Tuscany. She covered the New Year's Eve party in Edinburgh, and when she said the word partner, she paused for exactly the length of time it took for him to feel the weight of it. She covered the forensic accounting report. She covered the IRS filing, which had been submitted the day before. She covered the divorce petition, which had been filed 2 days before that. And then she closed the folder, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at him. She said, "I am not angry, Marcus. I want you to know that. I was angry, last October, for about 45 minutes, and then I decided that anger was a luxury I could not afford. I have spent the last 14 months being useful instead." Marcus said nothing for a very long time. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. A log shifted in the fireplace. Outside the window, the December garden was bare and gray, and honest in the way that winter gardens always are. He looked at the desk, at the labeled stacks, at the architecture of what she had built, and he understood something that he had never understood before, which was that his wife was not the woman he thought she was. She was not less. She was enormously, quietly, devastatingly more. And he had spent 14 years failing to see it. He said, "Finally, Cecelia, I can explain this." She said, "I know you can. I know you have explanations. I am not interested in them, Marcus. We are past that." He said, "What do you want?" And she said, "Exactly what I'm entitled to. Half the marital assets, which Patricia O'Sea's report makes clear, are significantly larger than what you have disclosed to date. Primary physical custody of the children, with a generous but structured visitation arrangement for you. And I want the Knightsbridge apartment transferred to marital assets, since it was purchased with marital funds." He started to speak. She said, "And I want a settlement within 60 days. Because if we go to trial, the MG Advisory Group documentation becomes part of the public record, and the IRS filing becomes part of the public record, and the story of a Hargrove Capital managing director hiding assets in a shell company named after his mistress becomes the story that every financial journalist in the Northeast spends the next 6 months writing. I imagine the board would find that uncomfortable." The room was very quiet. He said, "You would do that?" She said, "Marcus, I already did the hard part. This is just paperwork." What followed in the weeks after that conversation was the systematic contraction of Marcus Hargrove's world, and what made it remarkable was how little of it Cecelia had to actively engineer. She had set the mechanism in motion. Gravity did the rest. The IRS opened a formal investigation into MG Advisory Group within 10 days of Patricia's filing. 2 agents appeared at the Hargrove Capital offices on a Tuesday morning, which was not the kind of thing that happened quietly in a firm that prided itself on discretion. The managing partners called an emergency session that afternoon. Marcus attended it and attempted to present the investigation as a routine compliance matter, a paperwork issue, easily resolved. He was a convincing speaker in normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. The partners had already retained outside counsel by the time he finished speaking. 2 days later, Marcus was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Simone called him 11 times on the day the news broke. He did not answer. This was the moment, later, that he identified as the one he was most ashamed of, not the affairs, not the shell company, not even the lies to Cecelia, but that particular cowardice. Simone had genuinely loved him, in whatever distorted shape love takes when it is built on a foundation of deception. She had reorganized her life around his promises, and when those promises became liabilities, he stopped answering the phone. She sent him one final message, which he read and did not reply to. It said, "I hope she was worth it." He was not sure which she Simone meant, Cecelia, or some other version of himself that he had been trying to become. He suspected Simone wasn't sure either. The Greenwich social world, which operates on the same logic as all small worlds built on status and proximity, recalibrated with remarkable speed. Invitations that had arrived for both Marcus and Cecelia now arrived for Cecelia alone. The charity committee that he had joined at her suggestion 3 years ago voted quietly to remove him from the roster pending resolution of his legal matters. 2 friends he had considered close stopped returning his calls, which he understood was not abandonment but arithmetic. They were calculating the cost of association. The number was too high. He was expensive now, and not in the ways he was accustomed to being expensive. He had moved into a suite at the Delamar Hotel in Greenwich, which was a perfectly comfortable hotel and which felt, given where he had come from, like a defeat of almost physical dimensions. He sat at the small desk in the suite on a Saturday night in mid-December and thought about the Georgian estate on 16 acres where his children were sleeping, and about his wife sitting at the antique writing desk in the study, and about how thoroughly he had dismantled everything that had actually mattered while pursuing things that had only seemed to matter. He understood now, too late, the difference. He had confused novelty with meaning. He had confused Cecilia's steadiness for stagnation. He had looked at a woman who was strong and seen a woman who was simply still, and he had gone looking for friction elsewhere, without understanding that what Cecelia had always offered was not the absence of challenge, but the deepest kind of challenge, the kind that asked him to be a better man, and he had declined that invitation 1,400 days in a row. He opened his laptop and began to type an email to her. He deleted it. He began again. He deleted it again. He sat for a long time with the cursor blinking in the empty message window. Finally, he typed 4 words. "I am so sorry." He stared at them for a while. Then he deleted those too, because he understood, finally, that sorry was not architecture. Cecelia had built something over 14 months. 4 words in an email was not a corresponding structure. It was a gesture in the direction of one, which was not the same thing at all. Stay with me, because what happens next changes the entire shape of this story. 3 weeks after the conversation in the study, Diana called Cecelia with news that neither of them had entirely anticipated. The IRS investigation had expanded. What had begun as an inquiry into MG Advisory Group's unreported income had widened, as these investigations tend to do when forensic accountants begin pulling threads, into a broader examination of Hargrove Capital's expense reporting over the previous 5 years. It appeared that Marcus's personal habits, the private jet usage, the client entertainment that was not entirely client entertainment, the conference registrations for events he had attended with Simone rather than colleagues, had been absorbed into firm expenses in ways that the IRS found difficult to characterize as legitimate business deductions. The investigation was no longer about a shell company. It was about the firm. Cecelia had not intended this. She had targeted Marcus's personal finances. She had not intended to destabilize a firm that employed 400 people, including 2 of her closest friends' husbands. She sat with this for a day, which was not a comfortable day. Then she called Diana and said she wanted to offer a cooperation agreement. She would make Patricia O'Sea's full report available to the IRS, including every document and every analysis, in exchange for an immunity provision that clarified she had no knowledge of and no participation in any firm-level misreporting. Diana said she had already drafted that agreement. Cecelia said, "Of course you did." Diana said, "I've been your lawyer for 14 months, Cecelia. I know how you think." The cooperation agreement was executed on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the IRS had the complete picture. By Friday, Hargrove Capital's outside counsel had presented Marcus with a choice. He could cooperate with federal investigators and accept the conditions of a negotiated settlement, or he could contest the investigation and allow the inquiry to proceed at its natural pace, which, the attorneys explained, could take between 3 and 5 years and would generate a quantity of public documentation that would effectively end his career in private equity, regardless of the outcome. Marcus, who was many things but was not a fool, chose cooperation. He began meetings with federal investigators the following Monday. Cecelia was not present for any of these meetings. She did not need to be. She was at the Greenwich Children's Foundation's Winter Gala, which she had organized one final time before her January departure from the chairmanship, wearing a deep green velvet gown and looking, by every account, precisely as she always looked: composed, elegant, entirely herself. A few people asked about Marcus, in the careful way that Greenwich people ask questions whose answers they already know. She said simply that they were divorcing, that it was amicable, and that she was doing well. She said it with such a complete absence of drama that several people walked away uncertain whether they had actually heard news or merely a weather report. And somewhere in the middle of the gala, standing near the orchestra with a glass of champagne, Cecelia allowed herself a moment of something that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of a woman who has done an enormous amount of careful work and has watched that work perform exactly as designed. She did not allow the moment to last long. There were people to talk to and food to organize and a live auction that needed her attention. She set her glass down and went back to work. That was always what she did. She went back to work. The divorce settlement was executed on February 14th, which was not a coincidence. Diana had scheduled the signing date deliberately because Diana had a sense of humor that was dry and absolute. Marcus's attorney, a man named Caldwell, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics and who had spent the past 6 weeks slowly understanding that aggressive tactics were not going to be useful in this particular negotiation, sat across from Diana in the conference room and did not make eye contact with Cecelia. Cecelia sat next to Diana with a yellow legal pad and a pen and looked at the documents with the focused attention of a woman who reads contracts the way she once read museum provenance records, looking for the precise location of value. The settlement was comprehensive. The Georgian estate went to Cecelia, with the mortgage, which was modest relative to the property's value, to be paid off from marital assets before division. The children's trust funds, funded by Hargrove family money over the previous decade, were restructured under Cecilia's sole administration until the youngest child turned 25. The investment portfolio was divided using Patricia O'Sea's valuations as the baseline, which meant Marcus could not dispute the numbers without disputing the forensic analysis, which would have required him to explain the forensic analysis in a public proceeding, which Caldwell had advised him strongly against. The Knightsbridge apartment was liquidated and added to the marital pool. The MG Advisory Group account, minus what had already been seized by the IRS as part of the cooperation agreement, was contributed in full. By the time the settlement was signed, Cecilia's share of the marital estate was substantially larger than Marcus had calculated when he first sat across from her in the study in December. because Marcus had done his initial calculations based on his disclosed assets, and Cecilia's calculations were based on Patricia O'Sea's. He signed everything with the focused, blank expression of a man who has made peace with a loss by relabeling it as a beginning. Cecelia signed with the same careful precision she brought to everything. When it was done, Diana closed the folder. Caldwell collected his copies. Marcus stood up and looked at Cecelia across the table. He wanted to say something. She could see it in the particular set of his jaw that she had read for 14 years. She met his eyes briefly and then looked away, and in that small movement she communicated everything she intended to communicate, which was that she had already said everything that needed saying, in December, in the study, in 22 measured minutes, and she had nothing left to add. He picked up his coat and walked out of the conference room. The door closed behind him. Diana said quietly, "It's done." Cecelia said, "I know." She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Then she said, "Let's go get lunch. I'm starving." Simone Arsenault, the architect from London who had been the other woman in this story for 18 months, did not become the villain here. This is important to note because the easiest version of this story makes her the villain, and the easiest version is wrong. Simone had known Marcus was married. She had not been lied to about that. She had told herself, as people in her position tell themselves, that the marriage was empty, that she was filling a space that would have been filled by someone regardless, that love is not a finite resource, and that her presence in Marcus's life subtracted nothing from Cecilia's. She had been wrong about all of this, but being wrong in the particular way that Simone was wrong is a human failing, not a monstrous one. She had loved a man who was not available to be loved the way she loved him, and she had paid for that with 2 years of her life and the particular damage done to a person who realizes they were chosen only for as long as they were convenient. She returned to Paris, where she was originally from, in the spring following the divorce. She reopened a small architecture practice she had shuttered when the relationship with Marcus intensified. She did not speak publicly about any of it. She did not seek attention or sympathy. She simply went home. And in going home, she discovered something that the story of her time with Marcus had obscured, which was that she was extraordinarily good at her work, that she loved the work in a way that was uncomplicated and renewable, and that a life built around that love was a richer life than the one she had been constructing in Knightsbridge. This is not a happy ending for Simone, so much as it is an honest one. She made it through. She became, again, primarily herself. That is sometimes the best that can be said. The Federal Cooperation Agreement resulted in a civil settlement with the IRS that cost Marcus approximately $2 million in back taxes, penalties, and interest. He was not criminally charged, which was the outcome his attorneys had worked toward, and which was, his attorneys reminded him, a good outcome. He did not feel that it was a good outcome. He felt that it was a result, which is a different thing. He resigned from Hargrove Capital formally in March, which was described in the firm's press release as a mutual agreement to pursue new opportunities, which is what press releases always say when they mean something else entirely. He spent several months in a state that he could only describe as formlessness, moving between the hotel suite and a rented apartment and the structured visits with his children that the settlement allowed him every other weekend and one evening per week. His children were, in the way of children who love their parents, both simple and complex about it. His oldest daughter was 14 and understood more than she said, which she expressed through a careful, assessing silence during his visits that reminded him uncomfortably of Cecelia. His son, 11, cycled between anger and normality in ways that broke Marcus in small daily increments. His youngest, 7, simply wanted him at bedtime and did not have a framework yet for why he was not always there. He showed up for all of it. He showed up consistently, which is the one thing he could say in his own defense during this period. He was present for the visits in a way that he had not been present during the marriage, freed, in the bitter way that loss sometimes frees people, from the competing claims of a life he no longer had to maintain. He eventually left Connecticut. He took a position with a smaller investment firm in Chicago, a family-owned operation that did not require the particular brand of performance that Hargrove Capital had always demanded. He worked hard. He lived simply. He called his children every day. He did not date, not because he was faithful to a marriage that had ended, but because he had spent a year trying to understand how he had become the man who did what he did, and he understood that the answer was not simple enough to resolve quickly. He was doing the work. It was slow. It was not interesting to anyone but him, but it was the most honest thing he had done in years. 2 years after the divorce was final, the Whitmore Foundation was established in Greenwich, Connecticut, funded in part by Cecelia's settlement assets, and in part by a significant gift from her family's estate. The foundation focused on 2 areas: arts education for children in underfunded Connecticut school districts, which reflected her background as an art historian, and financial literacy programs for women emerging from difficult marriages, which reflected everything else. The foundation's inaugural gala was held in April at the Georgian estate, which Cecelia had quietly and thoroughly made her own in the 2 years since Marcus had left. She had repainted rooms, she had replanted the garden, she had reorganized the library, removing the books that had been chosen for appearance rather than love, and replacing them with books she actually wanted in the house. She had turned the home office, which had been Marcus's space, into a room for her children, a comfortable, colorful space with beanbag chairs and a large drawing table that her youngest had immediately covered with crayon drawings of horses. The gala was attended by 400 people. Diana was there, Margaret Cho was there, Patricia O'Say was there, in small gold earrings, quietly pleased. Frank Delano, the private investigator in the tan jacket, was not there, but Cecelia had sent him a bottle of very good scotch with a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you for being thorough." Among the guests was a man named James Whitfield, a widower who had moved to Greenwich the previous year and who ran a nonprofit focused on sustainable agriculture. He had been introduced to Cecelia by a mutual friend at a dinner in January. He made her laugh. He read books she had not heard of and wanted to discuss them. He was, she said to Diana later, what she would have been looking for if she had known what she was looking for. They were not in any hurry. They had both been through enough to understand that the things worth having do not require rushing. They were careful with each other, and careful was exactly the right speed. Cecelia stood at the podium at the foundation gala and looked out at the room full of people. She said that the foundation existed because she believed that the most important thing a person could build was not wealth or reputation, but the interior life that survived when those things were stripped away. She said she was deeply grateful to everyone in the room. She said she was grateful, most of all, for the 2 years she had spent learning who she was when she stopped being a wife. Then she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that arrives after a long interior journey, the kind that costs something and is worth what it costs. The room applauded. The orchestra began to play. The evening continued in the way that evenings do, when they are made by people who understand what they are celebrating. This is the story of Marcus and Cecelia Hargrove. It is a story about what happens when a man confuses his wife's grace for his permission, when he sees her composure and reads it as contentment, when he watches her manage everything with precision and ease and mistakes that precision for the absence of a deeper life, a deeper mind, a deeper plan. Cecelia Hargrove did not scream. She did not confront him in the driveway. She did not send an email to Simone. She did not do any of the things that a woman in pain might do, when that pain is hot and immediate. She let the pain go cold, and when it was cold enough to carry without dropping, she picked it up and built something with it. Marcus lost the estate. He lost the firm. He lost the social world he had curated over 30 years. He lost his son's name, in a sense, because the Hargrove name in Greenwich would never again mean what it had meant the morning before he walked into that study. He lost Simone not because she was taken from him, but because the moment she became costly, he stopped answering the phone, and that is the truest thing the story says about who Marcus Hargrove actually was. What Marcus gained, if gain is the right word, was a smaller life that was finally proportional to the man he had actually been all along, rather than the man he had performed. He was living now at the true scale of himself, and there is something in that, some hard and necessary honesty, that is not without its own kind of worth. And Cecelia stood at her study window on the February morning after the settlement was signed and looked at the garden, at the red roses that were bare and dormant in the winter cold, at the 16 acres of frozen grass and old trees and good soil, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like the owner of her own life, not the custodian, not the curator, the owner. She had earned this ground. She had built this victory slowly and without anyone watching, in the dark, with careful hands and a mind that never stopped working and a heart that she had protected fiercely until the moment it was safe to put down again. She poured her tea. She went to work. Some women fall apart when they discover the truth about the men they married. Cecelia Hargrove folded the truth into something useful and carried it forward. That is a specific kind of strength, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that does not need a witness to be real, the kind that is simply there, day after day, doing what needs to be done, quietly and precisely and completely. The truth always comes out. But what happens after the truth? That part belongs entirely to you. What do you think? Did Cecelia do the right thing by waiting 14 months before she moved? Or would you have confronted him immediately? Tell me in the comments below. I want to know your thoughts. Every single comment gets read. If this story stayed with you, please hit the like button. It helps this channel reach more people who love stories just like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, click that button now and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Because next week, I am bringing you the story of a woman who discovered her husband had a second family 2 states away, and what she did with that information will leave your jaw on the floor. You do not want to miss it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, silence is not the same as surrender. Sometimes, silence is just a woman gathering everything she needs.